Okay, well, welcome to AMP2. That means that you successfully completed AP1. Pat yourself on the back. Congratulations. That's a tough course. So now we're into AP2, which means that we're going to change the course up a little bit. When you did AP1, it was memorizing the tissues. It was memorizing the names of the bones and the muscles and what they do in the nervous system. When we get to AP2, it's more, how do things work? What makes the body work? So we're moving from anatomy into really physiology, okay? We're still going to do some anatomy, but the emphasis is going to be really on the physiology, okay? And to do that, we start with the endocrine system, which is the brains of the entire thing. I'm going to be honest with you that the endocrine system is the toughest chapter of the two courses. So you're going to really need to work on this. You're going to have to study. You're going to have to learn these hormones, okay? So I'm just going to be honest with you. All right. So when we sit there and talk about the endocrine system, see if I can get this button to go. Sometimes we refer to it as the neuroendocrine system because it is truly tied in with the nervous system. And you integrate the endocrine system and the nervous system together, and that's going to regulate the body, maintain homeostasis, do all this coordination of these systems, and you'll see how this is done. So, and this is done primarily through messaging these hormones through the bloodstream, okay? You can see the list of the major endocrine glands. We'll be going through those and the hormones that they produce, okay? But what we refer to as an endocrine gland is a cell or a tissue or an organ that make up that system. They are ductless, okay? They secrete the hormones directly into body fluids, primarily the bloodstream. And the unique thing about the endocrine glands are they have target cells that have receptors for those hormones, and only those receptors work. If you don't have the receptor for the hormone does nada, nothing, okay? Versus exocrine glands, where exocrine glands secrete into ducts or tubes, and they will, deliver their products to that site, and that'll be the end of it. Endocrine, totally different. Specific receptors, specific target cells, and a function. So these are messengers, and we will be talking about these. But when we compare the nervous system and the endocrine system, they both function in communication. The difference is how they communicate. They use chemicals, but the nervous system, you learned about neurotransmitters that are released into synapses versus the endocrine system, which releases hormones into the bloodstream, okay? In general, the nervous system responds much faster than the endocrine system. Stick your finger into a flame, you very quickly move it away. Endocrine system, the hormones can be fairly quick, like epinephrine, but they can be, hours long, longer than that. So they last a lot longer, they hang around a lot longer. Think of some of your sex hormones, and I think you can imagine that. So they are released into the extracellular fluid, and then they diffuse into the blood. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but how they go to their target cell and where they go from there depends upon whether they are lipid soluble or water soluble. And they are very powerful in very low concentrations. It doesn't take a lot for some of these hormones, okay? So when we look at the hormones, we have two general types. We have steroid or steroid-like hormones, and then we have the non-steroid hormones. Steroids mean that they are derived from cholesterol. And you can tell a steroid hormone, most of them, because they're going to end in this E-R-O-N-E or S-T-E-R-O-N-E. Okay, so sterone or arone, something like that. So testosterone, aldosterone, those that you've heard before, those are steroid hormones. They are all produced from cholesterol. They have cholesterol as their base. Okay. The non-steroids can be, they're basically usually some kind of derivative of a protein, an amine, a protein, a peptide, a glycoprotein, something like that. And you can see like the amines, these are from your amino acids. You can have from proteins, you can have glycoproteins, meaning a protein with a sugar on it. And so they're slightly different. Okay. Now, so you can look at these. Most of these are amino acids again, steroids, cholesterol, and you can get the basic feel of these. So when we talk about these hormones, they each have different actions, but they exert their effects by altering metabolism. They can alter the enzymatic activity. They can change the rate of transport of a substance. They can do a lot of things like that. And basically what they do is they bind to their receptor inside the target cell or on the membrane of the target cell, depending upon what kind of hormone it is. And then they cause changes in that target cell, even with a very low concentration. Now, what's interesting is that the target cell has the ability to change the number of receptors depending upon what the concentration of those hormones are. So the number of receptors will determine the strength of response, but they can be upregulated or downregulated in response to hormone levels. So if your hormone levels get low, that target tissue can upregulate the number of receptors to try and pick up as much as it can so you can release more hormone. Okay. All right, so let's look at steroids and thyroid hormones. If you go back and look at, let's just go back a second and look at the thyroid hormone, and you can see the thyroid hormone TSH or THH. These are proteins. And then you have your steroids, okay? But they have poor water solubility, okay? Which means you can't just secrete these into the blood and have them, just move on through, okay? They're not real water soluble because of their lipid content. And so what we have to do is we have to bind them to a protein, a transport protein, to help them along, okay? Steroid hormones, they can diffuse through the lipid bilayer of the cell membranes. Thyroid hormones have specific transport methods, but both of these have a unique thing where they bind to receptors inside the cell, okay? And what happens is when they get inside the cell, they cause the transcription of particular genes in DNA, and that leads to protein synthesis, which leads to that action of that hormone. So anytime you see steroids, hormones, or thyroid hormones, think DNA, transcription of DNA, and then a protein synthesis from that. And if you remember that, that will help you. And you can look at that sequence that occurs, okay? And you can, if you take a look at this kind of walks you through that they bind, but they come in here and that messenger RNA will leave the nucleus and they enter the cytoplasm and they cause this translation of that RNA that leads to the synthesis of these proteins that are associated with that hormone. Non-steroid hormones can't penetrate the lipid bilayer of the cell membranes. They have to bind to the target. The target is on the membrane. So non-steroids, the target is on the outside of the cell. The thyroid hormones and the steroid hormones, the target is inside the cell. All right, so they bind to the receptor on that cell membrane, and the hormone is considered a first messenger. And basically you have a chemical, there's a binding to what we call a G protein, but that chemical induces changes that lead to the hormone's effect, and that is considered a second messenger. And most of these hormones use a hormone called cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP, as the second messenger. So if you just think of this, CAMP is the second messenger. And basically what that will do is you can see this whole procedure, but what it does is it activates protein kinases, which add phosphates. They add these substrates on, and that causes that, it activates those proteins and causes a series of reactions that lead to cellular changes with that hormone. I just want to mention prostaglandins. They are very, very important, and they're very potent in small amounts. They're like hormones. They're not quite hormones. They're not stored in cells, but they are synthesized just before their release. They can activate or inhibit or kind of control that CAMP production, changing the cell's response to the hormone. So we'll talk about them a little bit later on in the course, but they have a lot to do with regulating water and sodium in the kidneys and that sort of thing. I just wanted to mention them here. All right, so negative feedback, controlling with negative feedback. And again, most of these hormones are going to be controlled by negative feedback. And basically what it means is that this is a control mechanism where you have rising levels of hormone lead to a decrease in the hormone secretion. You have rising sugar levels. You secrete insulin to bring those sugar levels down. As the sugar levels go down, you change that insulin level, okay? And basically what happens is we have 3 different methods of doing this. We'll go through this again. But one is through the hypothalamus. We have regulating hormones in the hypothalamus. They are releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So you have a releasing hormone that tells the hormone to start being released, and those hormone levels go up. And then when they reach a certain point, it's like enough is enough. So then you start to secrete inhibiting hormones to bring it back down. Okay? And I mean, that's just the way that those work. Anything with the hypothalamus, again, hypothalamus controls the pituitary. A lot of people have heard the pituitary is the master gland. I like to say the hypothalamus is the master of the master because the hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. The pituitary hormones secrete those hormones that control the activity of those glands. Anytime you have a hormone that acts on another gland, it is called a trophic hormone. All right. You may also have the nervous system control. Sometimes the nervous system can directly stimulate some glands to secrete their hormones. Or you may have changes in the composition of the internal environment, again, like a specific substance, like I mentioned, glucose, something like that. And that will stimulate or inhibit the secretion of certain hormones. And as we go through this course, will be talking about those particular situations. But this is just the introduction to these hormones, so don't go crazy. So basically, negative feedback, you get a rise of a hormone, and basically you reach a certain limit, and that leads to a decrease in that hormone level. So when you get a lot of hormone being secreted, you don't need it, and so you back it off. There's a negative feedback. Positive feedback is just the opposite. This is where a rising level of hormone leads to an increase in more hormone. Okay? A couple of specific ones that are very often used is oxytocin. This is the hormone for labor. As a woman goes into labor, the more oxytocin that's secreted, the harder the contractions are. And that's how, as someone goes into labor, those contractions get harder and harder and harder until the baby is finally born. Same thing with prolactin. In terms of the production of the milk, oxytocin causes the milk to be released. The baby suckles, and the prolactin, is going to produce more and more milk, and then the baby will suckle and that sort of thing. So that's a positive feedback. You do something and you keep on doing it. Okay? So you can take a look at this. But this is just generally the way it works with the negative feedback control. You can see that releasing hormone up in the hypothalamus, going into the pituitary gland, which produces a hormone, which goes to an endocrine gland, which goes to the target cells. And we'll talk about some of these as we go along. All right, so on to the pituitary gland. This is, you should have learned, is in the sella-turcica of the sphenoid bone. It's at the base of the brain. It is attached to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum, or the pituitary stalk. There are two portions. There's the anterior lobe, the adenohypophysis, or the posterior lobe, the neurohypophysis. And it's the secretions from these two lobes that are controlled by different methods by the hypothalamus. So we have to look at that a little bit. All right, so first of all, the anterior lobe, the hypothalamus produces releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that are transported from the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe through what we call the hypophyseal portal vein. This is the portal vein system. It's a portal system, which means connected vein to vein. Usually you go, artery to arterial to capillary to venule to vein and back to the heart. Well, this is a connection of a venous system to a venous system, and we call those portal veins. You'll see that in the liver also. And what they do is you will get releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus that will tell the anterior lobe primarily to release hormones or stop releasing hormones. So each releasing hormone acts on a specific group of cells in that anterior pituitary to stimulate or inhibit the secretion of that pituitary hormone. For the posterior lobe, there are nerve impulses from the hypothalamus that travel to the posterior lobe through that infundibulum, and they stimulate the nerve endings in the posterior lobe to release hormones. So you can take a look at this picture, and it does a pretty good explanation. And again, you can see this portal system right here. Okay, really nice. All right, so the hypothalamus controls these hormones, the secretion from these endocrine glands. Basically a three-step pathway. You have a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus that acts on specific hormone-secreting cells in the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary hormone then acts on cells in the endocrine gland, wherever it may be, to stimulate its secretion. Okay, so usually there's multiple negative feedback control systems. And for example, a good one is thyroid hormone, just to give you an example of how this works. You have thyrotropin releasing hormone and thyrotropin inhibiting hormone, but when that hormone gets released out of the hypothalamus, that then goes to the pituitary, and it goes to the specific cells in the pituitary and causes the release of what we call TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. That gets released from the pituitary. Those hormones travel down, they find the thyroid gland, and then that causes the release of thyroid hormone. Okay? So the final hormone in the pathway would be those thyroid hormones. And so there's the first two hormones, the releasing hormone and the stimulating hormone from the pituitary, that's all they do. They cause the release or inhibition of a hormone, and for TSH, they stimulate the thyroid gland. That's all they do, okay? And so you need to understand that. It's the actual hormone, like the thyroid hormone that we'll talk about, that actually does the job, okay? All right. So the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland does consist of this glandular tissue. These hormones are produced in the anterior lobe by 5 different types of cells, and each of those hormones is released in response to a releasing hormone from that hypothalamus. And then some of them have inhibiting hormones that inhibit the release of hormones. So let's kind of look at some of these. Okay. So growth hormone is basically you have a releasing hormone and an inhibiting hormone. And you can see most of the time we love to use these initials because it's a whole lot easier. So you have growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. All right. So the hypothalamus, if we need growth hormone, then growth hormone releasing hormone is released. If that gets too high, then growth hormone inhibiting hormone gets released. Now, what's going to happen is this growth hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary. So, follow this. Maybe you need growth hormone for whatever reason. We'll talk about that. But that information would be sent to the brain. The hypothalamus would release growth hormone releasing hormone. That would travel down to the pituitary, and the pituitary would release growth hormone in response to that stimulation by growth hormone releasing hormone. All right? And again, when those hormones get too high, that information would be sent back to the brain. The brain would release growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which then tells the pituitary, tamp down on the growth hormone. Okay? So anytime you have an inhibiting or releasing hormone, that's the way it works. Okay? Prolactin, again, it is inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone. The stimulation is just the suckling or the oxytocin that causes that to be released. But they think that it's perhaps released by this prolactin releasing factor. Thyroid stimulating hormone, we just talked about this. That I said the thyrotropin releasing hormone that's in the hypothalamus, and that causes the release of TSH, which then will go to the thyroid gland. There is released from the pituitary is ACTH, sometimes called adrenocorticotropin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that is released by corticotropin releasing hormone, again, from the hypothalamus. And then you have gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that will cause the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So you can start to begin to do these out. What I would recommend that you start to do is kind of work through that tree, if you will, so that you understand this hormone causes the release of this hormone, which goes here, which causes this. So again, start to do these trees. All right, I'm in the hypothalamus. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, is released from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary, causes the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which then goes to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormone. And make sure you know that sequence of releases, okay? And if you'll do that, that'll help you through this a little bit. All right, some of the functions of the anterior pituitary hormones. We just went through the stimulating hormones, so let's talk about some of the other ones, because we said we have inhibiting hormones and we have releasing hormones, and we have growth hormone inhibiting hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. Well, what do these hormones do? All right, so growth hormone, sometimes called somatotropin, somato meaning the general cells. Anytime you see the prefix somato, think of your general cells, not your reproductive cells. Okay, so these are going to stimulate these cells to enlarge and divide. Growth hormone, you're repairing. You're growing new cells. Maybe you broke something. Maybe you injured something. You've got to repair. So in order to do that, you want to stimulate these cells to divide. You want to get the, proteins in there, so you get amino acid uptake, you get protein synthesis. You're going to make sure you have your connective tissues built, that sort of thing. But you basically want to bring your tissues, the things you need to make that cell and get them in there, and it stimulates that to make sure that those cells are able to grow properly. Prolactin, we have prolactin and we have oxytocin. Prolactin is production of milk. You're lactating, and that's one of the ways to remember this. So this is milk production versus oxytocin, which is milk ejection. Totally different. All right, so we talked about TRH causing the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, I get this all the time on tests when we ask what hormone is, heat production, metabolism. It is not TSH. The only thing TSH does is stimulate the thyroid hormone, the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. That's all it does. It's a signal to the thyroid gland to say, we need more thyroid hormone produced. That's all it does. ACTH, again, adrenal. So this is going to stimulate the secretion of cortisol, glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. All right. So it's all in the name, adrenocorticotropic, glucocorticoids from the adrenal gland. So if you kind of take a look at the name, a lot of times it will help you with this. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. This is development of ovarian follicles and helping in the sperm production in the males. Luteinizing hormone, a surge of LH causes ovulation in the females. And that's how we're able to track when ovulation is occurring. Okay, so again, what you want to do is make this tree. A lot of students have problems with trying to, oh my God, what am I going to do trying to remember all of these? Make trees. Follow the pathway. You can see this. TRH causes the release of TSH, which causes the release of T3, T4. CRH, ACTH, and on. So you just kind of make these trees so that you kind of separate it out, and make it in discrete blocks of information that you can handle, okay? Don't try and do it all at one time. Do that for the pathway. So like the pathway for the thyroid hormone. Just an example of doing this. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, secreted by the hypothalamus. All right, the hypothalamus, its target is the anterior pituitary. Goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to secrete TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH goes from the anterior pituitary to the thyroid gland and causes the thyroid gland to secrete, you're going to learn, T3 and T4. And it is the T3 and T4 that have the effect on the target cells. Okay? Again, this is a negative feedback, and the levels of the thyroid hormone will exert a negative feedback on the secretion of TRH, and TSH. So if your thyroid gland hormones start to drop down, that feedback is sent to the hypothalamus, which increases the production of TRH, which then causes the increase in production of TSH, which in turn will then increase the production of T3 and T4. Okay? And that's, you have to remember. All right, so posterior pituitary hormones. There are two hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. They are stored and released by the posterior pituitary. And they get sent down to the posterior pituitary gland via, we talked about this infundibulum, this pituitary stalk. So these two hormones, the first one is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, sometimes called vasopressin. And the way to remember what this does is when you think about a diuretic, you pee. You're trying to lose water. So this is an antidiuretic, all right? And what happens is that when you urinate in large quantities, okay, what happens is you're losing water, you're losing sodium, you're losing water. So what antidiuretic hormone does is it decreases urine production because it decreases the volume of water that the kidneys are losing. And if you think about it, this is going to affect your blood pressure because the blood is mainly water. If you take the volume and change the volume of the water in the blood vessel, that is going to change your blood pressure. So if you pull the sodium from the kidneys and pull it into the blood vessels and the water follows, blood pressure increases. So this is why antidiuretic hormone works. You decrease urine production by reducing the volume of water that the kidneys are excreting. You hold that water in, and that will increase blood pressure. Okay? All right. Oxytocin, as we mentioned, causes muscle contraction. Causes muscle contraction in the uterine wall during childbirth. Again, this is a positive feedback mechanism. The further you go into the labor, the harder the contractions. The more oxytocin that is excreted into this system, the harder the contractions. And it just keeps doubling up and doubling up and doubling up. And this is why as you go further and further into labor, it becomes more and more painful. All right, same thing with milk ejection. Oxytocin causes, we talked about this, the ejection of the milk that is produced by the stimulation of prolactin. Okay. All right, so we're going to take an intermission because I know this is a little tough. Take a deep breath, go somewhere, come back, and we'll finish this again. This is the toughest chapter, so take a deep breath and come back in and go for part 2.